Welcome to the Nightly News Podcast. This is Professor Paul Miller sitting in the Sear Harris Podcast Studio in the Boyer House of the Summerdale campus of Central Penn College. We're in for episode 59 on the podcast, and I'm being joined here by Nightly News President Brian Christiana. Brian, welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Mr. Miller, for having me again.
Don't sound like it's such a chore. I mean, come on.
No, this is great. This is a great episode we're going to be having today.
This is an honor. We have a newcomer to the podcast today. The individual that we're having down, we're having this podcast to celebrate the birthday of one of our most adored and beloved U.S. presidents, John F. Kennedy. And his birthday is on May the 29th. So in just 1 week would have been his 101st birthday. So that's part of the reason that we're having the gentleman down here today. We are being joined by the chair of the legal studies and, of course, professor in the legal studies department, John DeLeo. John, one of our esteemed three-time Faculty of the Year award winners. It's such an honor to have you down today.
It's great to be here. Appreciate the invitation.
So, John, one of the things that we are going to be talking about, well, basically the whole thing we're going to be talking about today is JFK. JFK, now, of course, it was before my time. It was, of course, before Brian's time, but still a subject that is heavily talked about, debated, discussed on so many different levels. And so I want to talk a little bit more. Obviously, JFK is somebody who's been somewhat important to your life, obviously, but is also something you've used in the classroom. One of the things that we talked about off air was that in the past, you do every December, you do a mock trial. In the courtroom, and that the Clay Shaw case, the trial of Clay Shaw, was one of the mock trials that you do frequently, and now you've said is now becoming an annual thing.
Yes, we've been doing that as part of our Civil Litigation 2 class in the fall, but we get the students ready all term, and by this first week of December, they're ready to go. And they have their attorney coaches that coach them up, and they get into the groups. So we're simulating what they would do in a law practice. Paralegals can't practice law in courtroom, but it's good to see how the preparation that it takes to get into a case, and all the hours and hours you need outside the courtroom to make you look good inside the courtroom. And so they learn that part of it, and they learn teamwork and cooperation. And we usually have them. They get to pick whether they want to be an attorney that night or they want to be a witness, but they get it from both sides to do opening statements, closing. And so we put it on in our courtroom with really a realistic setting, and we keep everybody in character as we go through it. So it's a really good experience. And what happened with the reason I started doing this, in addition to my interest, is that the transcripts of the Clay Shaw trial, what happened in New Orleans in 1969, became available online. And Clay Shaw was a local businessman from New Orleans who was actually charged, the only person charged in the assassination, charged with conspiracy to assassinate the president. Well, why is it in New Orleans? Well, that's where the alleged conspiracy was hatched with a guy named David Ferry and, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald. That was the allegations of that trial. So I took those real live transcripts and I put them into a form of a mock trial. And I had to condense things, of course, because we only could have 3 witnesses on each side. But it's a chance for the students to not only learn the law, how to do a court procedure, but also history. So it's a double win, I think, for the students.
Now, and we probably will address this here later in the podcast, but now that we're on this subject, this is also the trial that's the subject of Oliver Stone's JFK.
Yes.
And this is honestly, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, one of the reasons that I've over the years been so interested in this is because of that film. Mm-hmm. Big Oliver Stone fan, but certainly, and I was relatively young when that came out, but we certainly realized that Oliver Stone took an artistic license in the film.
Yeah.
How accurate was the film in terms of, from your perspective, that's seen the whole transcript and has studied it immensely?
Well, it followed very closely the trial of Clay Shaw, which was brought by District Attorney Jim Garrison. And he is a controversial figure in and of himself. the way that the witnesses were brought in, and the way he started looking into the assassination. And he would come on the TV and claim, "I know who the conspirators are, and I will expose them at such and such a time, and I know where they are, and we're going to just gather them up." Well, he never was able to actually do that, but he did charge this man named Clay Shaw with the assassination. So the movie depicts that, and Kevin Costner, plays Jim Garrison, so he's a likable figure. So it's true to the Clay Shaw trial, but I would advise everyone to take that with a grain of salt and do your own research. And over the course of time, I've put a lot of books. I've asked the librarian to have our library with certain books on the assassination. So look at a whole variety of areas. Who say that Oswald acted alone? This conspiracy, that conspiracy, and kind of make your own judgments. That's the way to do it. Another thing about the film is what Stone does, which can be tricky too, is he morphs real footage with the movie footage. And if you're not familiar with things, you're not quite sure. Are you watching the Zeb Ruder film, which captures the assassination, or are you watching Oliver Stone's depiction of it? So that is another thing that you really need to be experienced to get the most out of the film.
The film was a very good movie. I mean, I enjoyed the film very much, and but this whole John F. Kennedy assassination thing, there's a lot of interesting facts. As you said, we talked about in your media and politics class as well.
Well, and certainly, Brian, we are going to talk a lot more about the assassination in the second segment of
Yes.
the podcast, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the conspiracy theories that have hung around over these years, and in fact may have been perpetuated by Stone's film. But I do want to talk a little bit more about Kennedy, because Kennedy, as I mentioned, we were about to celebrate his 101st birthday here posthumously, but I want to talk a little bit more about why Kennedy was such a beloved president, which obviously starts with his military background. Could you just share and enlighten the audience a little bit more about what his military background was?
Yes. During World War II, he was a young man, and he actually started in naval intelligence. And he came from a powerful family, and I'm assuming that's how he kind of got a very cushy job as a naval intelligence officer. I think he was stationed in South Carolina. In those days, it was if you wanted to be in politics, it was wonderful to have a combat experience on your record. So a lot of these folks would go into the war thinking of their future. And so he was a young man, and he was assigned to a naval patrol boat called a PT boat. He was assigned to PT 109. And there was a movie in the early 60s while he was still president, so if you ever see that one, it's called PT 109. And Cliff Robertson plays JFK in that movie. And he doesn't use a JFK accent, though. He said he deliberately did not want to use a Boston accent in that. The story goes that it was a patrol boat, and they were in the South Pacific, and a Japanese, I think it was a destroyer, just chopped the PTO boat in half. And some of his crew were killed, and he's given credit for saving the crew and getting them to safety. And they found hiding. They had a hideout on an island there, and then they eventually were able to get rescued. So, if you to make a long story short, he was considered to be a hero of World War II, and that was kind of good for his resume.
Well, of course, anytime you're a war hero, I mean, not that Schwarzkopf did a lot in politics, but he certainly, and then there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, being a war hero is certainly something that should be celebrated. And so that certainly led to him then moving on into government, if you want to continue.
So after World War II, and he had a lot of health issues.
I was going to bring that up eventually.
Even as a young man, if you want to jump in on that. And so he had to overcome that, but he started off, well, not at the lowest rung, right? He starts off as a congressman, and he runs for Congress in the House of Representatives, and he wins that election. And from the House, and then the step up would be to go to the Senate. So in 1952, he runs for the Senate, and he becomes a senator for Massachusetts, which obviously very prestigious. He wasn't really known for a lot of legislation while he was a senator, and he had a reputation of being a playboy in the sense that he wasn't really hard-nosed as far as going, working in the legislature and getting legislation passed. He really came to prominence too in the 1950s when he was a chairman of a committee that was investigating organized crime and in the labor unions, and he had his run-ins with Jimmy Hoffa, who was the president of the Teamsters Union, and there's still film on this that you can see probably on YouTube, and of those two going at it, and also his brother, who was a counsel of the committee, Robert Kennedy, going at it with Jimmy Hoffa. So he became in prominence as that one method because of that committee.
Mr. DeLeo, let me ask you.
Yes.
Do you think Jimmy Hoffa is under Giant Stadium?
Well, that's one of those mysteries. I think almost like the assassination itself,
Yeah.
right? We will never know. I think the Giant Stadium thing has been debunked pretty much.
Yeah, the new MetLife Stadium.
Brian, do you have anything specifically on some of his health problems while he was growing up?
I have I did some research for the classes we were talking about, and I found that John F. Kennedy was diagnosed with Addison's disease, which is a rare endocrine disorder. It occurs when the human body produces insufficient amounts of certain hormones produced by your adrenal glands. It occurs in all your age groups, and it can be life-threatening. So, I mean, he was dealing with that for a long, long time, and we'll talk about it later in the conspiracy theories, and I was telling Mr. DeLeo, with that disease, it actually could have impacted if he survived the shot by Mr. Oswald.
Wow.
Yeah.
In some ways, had a very nice life because of how his family was,
Mom and Dad.
how he was regarded within in first Massachusetts, but then later nationally. But he also had a lot of hardships, whether it's almost dying in the South Pacific or whether it's some of his health issues. So I think a lot of people maybe at the time, I think they did a good job kind of hiding this. I think a lot of people at the time thought, this is, rich guy Kennedy here. But he really had a little bit tougher of a track to get to where he ended up becoming, which was, of course, our president of the United States.
I mean, the symptoms of this disease, it's extreme fatigue, weight loss, low blood pressure, low blood sugar, and muscle or joint pain. So imagine how busy he was at the time, and I could just imagine what he was going through every day.
And a lot of people look back to Kennedy and regarded him for his youth at the time, but meanwhile...
He was probably in the body of a 50-year-old man.
I was literally just going to say the same thing, and I appreciate that. Well, John, I want to move on to the next aspect, and this is something where I kind of want to weigh in a little bit on this, and that is the election of 1960 when JFK beat Richard Nixon for the presidency. And where I would like to chat about this a little bit is I use this as a case study and how politicians use television or any visual medium, certainly video and things now on social media and those types of things. There are a lot of individuals out there at the time that, in fact, believed that Kennedy won in a historically very close election because of the debates that were televised on TV. Yeah. Could you maybe elaborate on some of that a little bit?
Yes, I think that was pretty unique. That probably was the first time of presidential election where we had live debates. And I think there was a series of 3 of them. And you have to think that Kennedy, with limited experience and background, going against the sitting vice president of the United States. So Richard Nixon was vice president of the United States under Eisenhower, very popular president. And he was a senator himself. He was a congressman, and obviously very well known. He had run-ins with Nikita Khrushchev, who was the head of the Soviet Union, and he had credentials of being a very forceful politician. And here was Kennedy on the scene. And we talked about his health. I think I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on the podcast, but I think he took, Brian, if you remember this, massive amounts of steroids.
I'm sure he did.
For those issues that he had. Yeah. So if you see pictures of him as a younger man, and even they have videos of him, very skinny, very thin. Sometimes he looks very, very pale and drawn. You see him in the debates, he looks like a goddess there.
Yeah, I think we talked about the one time how in the one debate he had to lean on his podium. He relied on his podium to keep him standing. Yeah,
the story goes that for that particular debate, he was well rested. He probably had his medical treatment.
Yep.
He had all the makeup on, and he had a very impressive figure to the cameras. Nixon, on the other hand, I think he had made a pledge that he was going to visit every single state in all 50 states. So he was He was traveling all over.
Wow.
He was drawn. He said he was a little under the weather, and he looked pale on TV. And I think there was a little going back and forth for the preparations. From what I could remember about that Kennedy put on makeup, and he really looked better with the makeup. And I think Nixon either refused the makeup or had minimum makeup because he didn't think that was
And it was a new medium too, so it was something he was unfamiliar with. So just bring this and tie this all together. Nixon had a knee injury a couple of weeks beforehand, which led him to probably having to lean on the podium. He had lost weight because of the tour that you're talking about. It was a whirlwind tour. You know, when you're trying to meet as many people as you can, you're probably not eating correctly. He had lost weight, and he also did refuse to wear makeup. And apparently, some of the clothing choices that he made were not very well done. On the other hand, Kennedy was well rested. He knew how important it was to look well because he's always struggled with this. Now, that all said, people who listen to the radio broadcast of this almost at a 4-to-1 clip put Nixon
as the winner.
But because of the way that many people in the early 60s had adopted television technology, many of the people were watching this on TV. To the visual respect, Kennedy was the winner.
So Kennedy television was pretty much if it wasn't for television, Richard Nixon might have been the president at the time.
I don't say might, I say
he probably would have.
I say guaranteed because I don't know if you even realize this, Brian, but the popular vote. Now, of course, we understand that the popular vote does not matter, but the popular vote was 49.7% to 49.5%. So
wow, that's so close.
Historically, one of the most closest elections. Polls also revealed that more than half of all voters had been influenced by the debates, and 6% claimed that the debates alone had decided their choice. Wow. So that is incredible, the role that television played. And this is part of the reason that I've always been very interested in this election, because as somebody who teaches mass media, I use it as sort of a case study on how it's very interesting. I actually liken and compare it to how Barack Obama used social media. Barack Obama, his first term, going up against someone with much more of a resume politically than himself, very, very close, popular, and electoral. But Barack Obama used many, many strategies on social media that McCain did not use. And it was a very interesting corollary between JFK and Nixon and Obama's first term when he was elected president, showing the impact of some of our mass mediums. And it really usually comes down to even our current President Trump. Our current President Trump used Twitter unlike any other political candidate, and still to this day remains using Twitter.
That's right.
But say what you like about Trump, he and how he was elected president by how he used social media is going to be studied for years and years to come. So those that are embracing new technologies over the last 60 years, we find that are usually the ones who end up victorious for president. So I found that very interesting. I do want to talk quickly about some of the main things. Now, here's what a lot of people don't realize. Kennedy didn't even serve 3 full years in office. He certainly did not serve an entire term, and was in office from 1961 to November of 63. So, close to 3 years. Why is he still remembered? What were some of the things that he did? Now, obviously, we were in a tumultuous time, and there was obviously right smack in the middle of the Cold War. But what were some of the things that Kennedy did in his basically, not even 3 full years that make him still regarded as one of the most important presidents?
And talking about TV, too, was important that he had a young family, he had small children, and that was always in the media. And then, I think the public was just, fascinated by that because we had just had General Eisenhower as president. He was one of our oldest presidents, and his children were all grown. So we had this young president. Again, 43, he was the youngest president elected. Teddy Roosevelt was the youngest president. He came into office when McKinley was assassinated. So coming in at only age 43 with this, a glamorous wife and 2 little kids and cute little kids. So that was part of the image. Like sometimes they call it that Camelot, the image of Camelot. And he came into office, and he was a great public speaker. He gave a great inaugural address.
I will tell you that in my public speaking classes, my first assignment is watch JFK's inaugural speech, and then I found some very poor speech, and I said, compare these two speeches. Tell me why this Kennedy speech is regarded as one of the best ever. Of course, the ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. It's a line that everybody knows to this day. So his public speaking ability was fantastic.
And he had the benefit of having a great speechwriter, Theodore Sorensen. Ted Sorensen was his aide as a senator, and he took him onto the staff. And some of his great speeches that Kennedy gave were written by Ted Sorensen. So he had some help, but the delivery, you can't replicate that. So he comes into the office, with this great image and this young president. And in the close election, I have to say, Nixon was gracious and conceded. He could have challenged the election, as you were saying. It was so close. He didn't. He conceded. He said, "I'm going to abide by them." And Nixon was not. He was a young man also. I think he was only just 2 or 3 years older. So Nixon said, "Okay, I'm going to bide my time," and had a good transition into office. Similar to Obama's transition, he was gracious about it and had a good transition to the new president. And so he's in office, and he has some initiatives that we're aware of. The Peace Corps. He was again given credit for starting the Peace Corps. Right when he was in office, again, the whole thing about Cuba, and Brian and I talked about this, was we don't think about it today, but it was in the forefront of all of our national security concerns because we have a communist regime now led by the Castro brothers and Che Guevara, right 90 miles from our shores. So that was on our mind. And again, younger folks will see this in history, but not live through it. We have the Cold War going on with the bipolar world with two superpowers, the USSR, the Soviet Union, and the United States. So that's all in the background. And so because we were so concerned with Castro as a national security, even under Eisenhower, we had developed plans to invade Cuba and overthrow the government, the communist government in Cuba. And this was one of the things that Nixon had to, I guess he had to keep this under wraps. He couldn't argue this, or he couldn't put this forward because it was obviously a secret mission. But Kennedy inherited that, and the CIA people came to him, and the general said, "Hey, this is going to work. We can do this." And people won't know it as the Bay of Pigs, and they usually put the word fiasco at the end of it. And it
was a
failed attempt to overthrow Castro, and the Cubans who exiles were just wiped out at the beaches, and it made Cuba even stronger. In fact, there was an interview with Che Guevara, who was running the place with Castro, saying, thanking the United States for you had that when you did that, gave us momentum, and it united our people, and it was the big giant America coming at us, and that you did the greatest favor by trying to invade us.
Which is ironic because we look back at Kennedy as such a great president, and he basically starts off his campaign by a huge failure in Cuba.
But a lot of it is how he handled it, because he took the heat for it. In other words, he got on. He didn't hide or run or blame anybody else. He went out to the press corps, and I think he said, "I'm the principal officer of the government here, and I'm responsible." He didn't blame it on the CIA or intelligence he said, "I'm the principal director here, the officer of the executive branch, and it's my responsibility." And I think that, again, for a disaster, it boosted him up probably in the polls because he took responsibility for it.
Absolutely. What were some of the other things? I mean, obviously, one of the big things that we talk about, and even more irony here, that this is also one of the big conspiracy theories out there, the space race and the landing on the moon. What did that... I mean, obviously, this is sort of a component of the Cold War. The whole reason that we wanted to do this and we wanted to be there first was because of the space race that we were, ongoing with the USSR. What did that... I mean, we already have the Bay of Pigs going on, and then with the space race too. What did that mean to our country?
Again, it was a pride thing, almost like the Olympics. When the Soviet Union used to go against the United States, and in 1957, the Soviets put the first satellite into space called Sputnik, and that just sent shockwaves through the United States. And so they developed. The Soviet Unions, I guess, were ahead of us in rocket technology and getting things in payloads into space. And Kennedy came in, and that, again, raised his popularity by giving great speeches to saying that we're going to have a goal to put a man on the moon by the end of the century, in the 60s. And he put the resources behind it. And, of course, he had to go to Congress and ask for the money. And so he was very persuasive in getting money. What do you mean going up to space? Why do we want to do this? But he was able to convince the country that this was a worthwhile thing. And when I'm growing up in the 60s, my heroes were the astronauts. So, John Glenn and Alan Shepard and all those, Gus Grissom were the original astronauts. And after we had a successful space launch, there would be a big parade, go to the White House, but again, the Soviets were ahead. They had the first man in space. They had the first person to orbit. I think they might have put the first dog or cat into space too.
It was a dog, yeah.
It was a dog, and so we had Alan Shepard go up as our first person into space, and he has a parade. And then John Glenn is the first American to go around to orbit, and again parades. But I think the setting a goal, I think, was the key again for his popularity. And of course, he did not live to see it. Ironically, it was President Nixon in 1969 who welcomed the Apollo 11 astronauts back. But setting that goal and then going ahead and getting close to achieving it, and we finally caught up and surpassed the Soviets.
And even more interesting, so we have the space race, we have the development of the Peace Corps, we have the issues with the Bay of Pigs and Castro. We're also getting into the Civil Rights era and also the Vietnam War. I mean, could there have been a more unbelievable time than the early 60s in U.S. history ever? I mean, even as far back to the Civil War, did so much happen in just a short period of time. And I think that a lot of people, when they look back, especially those that didn't live through it, I think may think that Kennedy served for longer than 2.5 years, but that's definitely not the case.
I don't know if you guys knew this, but I'm sure Mr. DeLeo did, Mr. Miller. I hope you do. At first, Martin Luther King didn't even like John F. Kennedy, I found out.
Huh.
Yeah, originally, Mr. King I read he was in prison, and John F. Kennedy made a phone call to his wife, and his wife actually got her husband, Martin Luther King, to meet together with John F. Kennedy, and that's how they formed a relationship. But originally, Martin Luther King was not a fan of John F. Kennedy.
Well, it's clear to me that Kennedy had a profound impact on our history, and I do think that it's so interesting that all of these things were happening in such a short period of time. But we are going to take just a short break here. We're sitting here today with Chair of the Legal Studies Department, John DeLeo, and we appreciate him being so gracious with his time today. We're going to do a second segment with him, so we will be right back with a little bit more, and we're going to talk about the JFK assassination and corresponding conspiracy theory when we return on the Nightly News Podcast.
You are invited to join us for our 14th annual Business Partner of the Year breakfast on Tuesday, June 5th. We will be recognizing a company/organization that has gone above and beyond in partnering with our Career Services Department in Central Penn College. Our keynote speaker will be Amanda King, President of Operum HR, with her presentation, Everyone Impacts Culture. Please RSVP by May 29th. Please feel free to bring a guest with you. Please inform Rabina Azizdan if you can bring a door prize at rabinaazizdan at centralpenn.edu.
Welcome back to the Nightly News Podcast. This is Professor Paul Miller here today, sitting in with the Chair of the Legal Studies Department, John DeLeo, and we're sitting here talking about JFK as we are about to celebrate on May the 29th, JFK's 101st birthday. We are shortly going to talk about the assassination of JFK and some of the corresponding conspiracy theories, but we certainly did not even get to talk about some of the most important things in JFK's tenure in office. We had talked about how Nixon and Kennedy's debates on television and versus radio and how that impacted the election and how close the election was. We also talked about the Bay of Pigs, and we talked about the space race. But there were certainly a couple of other very important things that happened during Kennedy's tenure, one of which being the Bay of Pigs. Can we let's talk a little bit about that? I think a lot of people don't really realize what the Bay of Pigs even was or how close we were to not being around anymore.
Yeah. Well, the Bay of Pigs is the invasion of failed invasion of Cuba in 1961. Followed on again, Cuba, so prominent in our history at that time. The Cuban Missile Crisis, based after the Bay of Pigs happened. So again, this is the backdrop of the Cold War, and there was a crisis in Berlin, which in those days, if there was an East Berlin and a West Berlin, and the communists controlled the East Berlin, and there was such an influx of East Berliners coming over and East Germans coming over to the West that that's when the Berlin Wall came up again in history. So there was this big confrontation between Kennedy and Khrushchev over Berlin, and the Soviets had massed hundreds of thousands of troops there, and could they overrun Europe? That was a key. And the only thing we had, we had a lot of military power, but we would use maybe nuclear weapons to stop them, and nobody wants to use nuclear weapons. And so Cuba turned to, as it became a communist country under Castro, and had an alliance with Khrushchev. And so they cooked up this plan where they were going to put, and did put, nuclear missiles in Cuba. And because of our surveillance, we had the U-2 planes at that time. Satellites were really just coming into play. And so our U-2 spy satellites found missile sites on Cuba. And for 13 days, the world kind of was on edge whether there would be a nuclear war or not, because those missiles could strike New York and Washington within minutes. And again, one of the things that, again, in the lore of Kennedy was his ability to diffuse the crisis and keep it from escalating into a major nuclear war, which nobody would win in that case.
Absolutely not.
But
no one would win in really any case in any nuclear war. Although some argue that Hiroshima and Nagasaki nuclear bombs actually saved millions of lives. But it certainly took a while for that to come to fruition as far as it being any type of advantage whatsoever. And fortunately, since have not had any more nuclear weapons diffused. So you believe that it was Kennedy's demeanor and negotiation ability?
I think so, and his coolness under pressure, and his getting advice from the generals who were for an invasion of, and in fact, if researchers want to take a look at this, if the listeners want to, there's actually tape recordings, audio tapes of the deliberations of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the generals were saying that, let's invade, and bomb and get the sites. And so one of the questions Kennedy asked and said, well, good, if we do bomb all at the sites and invade, can you guarantee we would get every single site? And the general said, no, we can't. We can probably get 85%. So 15% of those missiles can strike Washington and New York. So no, we're not going to invade. And he settled for a lot of back-channel negotiations, but basically it was a swap to say, well, we're not going to invade Cuba. We will take our missiles out of Turkey. This is a side deal that we found out later. And then Khrushchev had he saved face, and he withdrew the missiles. So that's diffused it. So that could have, because that was one of the accomplishments, I guess, saving the world. I guess you can't get any better than that, right?
No, absolutely not. Well, and certainly, and listen, we could go on for an entire podcast about all the things that JFK did, but there's certainly something else that we want to talk about, and that's obviously the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that was pushed into law by LBJ, but also in 1961 and 62, the Federal Armed Forces integrating the University of Mississippi and University of Alabama.
Yes, because of certain Supreme Court decisions. And one of the big ones that people study all the time is Brown versus Board of Education, saying that separate but equal is not constitutional. And there was a lot of resistance to that decision. Some African-American students wanted to go to college and enroll at the University of Mississippi, and they were not allowed to do so. But Kennedy made sure that the military, the National Guard was federalized, and he made sure that those students were admitted into the University of Mississippi. And now in 1962, similar situation in the University of Alabama. Airborne Division was brought in, and there was a famous picture that you can, again, probably see this on YouTube, of the then governor of Alabama, George Wallace, literally standing in the schoolhouse door saying, these students will not be admitted. And then Nicholas Katzenbach was the president's representative there, and he said, "Okay, Governor, you've had your show now, and we're going to enforce this court order." And he stepped aside, and the students were admitted.
I'm not trying to get off topic or anything, but this might be a little silly too. But do you remember in the movie with Tom Hanks, Forrest Gump, when they have that scene?
Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of like what you were just talking about, like all the military people were there, and then you just see Forrest come pick up a book, and he goes, "Ma'am, I picked up your book," or "You dropped your book."
Well, what's interesting is certainly with Forrest Gump is that he just seems to fortunately end up in a lot of very big areas.
He met President Kennedy at the White House.
Yeah.
Well, it is a fictitious movie.
Yeah, I know.
But honestly, with some of the discussions about all that was going on in this important time in office, and the fact that he only served just under 3 years, and the fact that he was able to... obviously, the Cold War continued well after, far into the 80s, but he certainly took us back from nuclear war. He helped to integrate our schools and colleges. He was he led us to our space program. And I mean, we could continue to go on and on about all the things he did. But clearly one of the reasons that JFK is still so large in the lore of our country has to do with the assassination of JFK. Yes. And I think it also had to do a lot with the fact that television was such a big deal and the fact that people saw it happen. And I don't know, everybody on this planet has had to have seen the Zapruder film at some point in their lives. Not the original, but certainly copies of it. And I mean, I've seen it. And if you've seen the movie JFK, you then see the Zapruder film 100 times from, and Jim Garrison goes on and on about that too. But what's very interesting about the JFK assassination is, it happened all the way back in 1963. And what's interesting so much about this is the amount of conspiracy theory that surrounds this case. Yes. Do you think that, where do you think all of this came from? I mean, we can talk about conspiracy theory in a general sense, maybe in just a minute, but why do you think that conspiracy theory and doubt took over from the beginning?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the idea that the public, I don't believe, did not see the Zapruder film until maybe 1975. I think it was Geraldo Rivera, of all people, that got a copy of it and put it on television. Well, I think the idea, again, this strong, powerful young president being taken down by a 24-year-old loner, this guy named Lee Harvey Oswald. And I think that maybe people couldn't put those two things together, that this young man could end the life of the president. So maybe that started it, maybe.
And I think, too, though, what's interesting is because and we'll talk about some of these, because of his issues with the USSR in the middle of the Cold War, because of the Cuban connection, because of the mafia connection from earlier in his career, I think that there were so many actors out there that potentially could have been involved that it just never sat right. That, again, you mentioned the loner, a rogue shooter with, frankly, what always interested me about this case did he even have the ability to be such a quality marksman, and could his weapon even fire at the rate in which it was, explained?
Yeah, that's one of the things that after the assassination, we have the president, Vice President Johnson is now President Johnson, and he orders the Warren Commission to get. Because we can't have a trial of Oswald because obviously Oswald himself was assassinated 2 days later. So without a trial, Johnson puts together a Warren Commission headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren, and he had a lot of prominent people obviously on that commission. So maybe that kind of got started as far as it was not really made public. It came out very quickly. And when we started looking at the background of Oswald, that we has talked so much about the Cold War and the Soviet Union. Well, Oswald had spent time in the Soviet Union. So he was in the Marines. He did learn to shoot a weapon, in the Marines, so he had that ability. But FBI marksmen couldn't try to do what he did, hit a moving target, and a lot of them were not able to do that. So that, again, there's some doubt in that. And how he got out of the building, and the shots, did they come from the school book depository where he worked, from the 6th floor, or other folks said, oh no, the shots came from in front. So right off the bat, you have a controversy. And if they're coming from two different directions, Oswald could not be the lone assassin. And we can get into the more specifics of that. But that was the origins of it, that people would rush up to in front of the car and say, that's where the bullets came from. And the way Kennedy's body moved.
Back into the left. Yeah, I'm just going to steal
from the movie.
Yep, a line from Kevin Costner. But what's very interesting is this is certainly not the only conspiracy theory that exists, and we won't get into all those. I mean, a quick Google search, you'd find a million conspiracy theories. But really what a conspiracy theory is something as simple as this: a belief that some covert but influential organization is responsible for a circumstance or event. This, in the U.S. history, one of the biggest events that changed the course of our country, much like 9/11. And, of course, there's multiple 9/11 conspiracies because of the same thing. And a lot of people just don't want to believe it, or they want to have a better picture of the amount of control that people have over their lives, and often they're just not willing to accept these types of things. John, what's interesting is I was doing some research prior to the podcast, and a journalism company called 538, they did a Survey Monkey poll just last year, October 17th through October 20th of 2017, of 5,130 adults, and only 33% of Americans believe that one man is responsible for the assassination. On the other hand, 61% think that others were involved in a conspiracy. It crosses all demographics, all ages, all races. Do you think that that's an issue that even after all this time, we still haven't gotten on with the fact that maybe it was just Oswald?
Yes, that's and again, go back to the film. That reaches more people than people, millions of people, and makes an impression rather than people taking the time and doing the reading and doing the research and seeing, looking into it. So that could happen. And then you look at the background. You look at the theories. Well, let's start with the mafia theory, the organized crime theory. There's always a grain, I guess, from your research in conspiracies, there's always a grain of truth that runs through some of these conspiracies, right?
A lot of conspiracy theorists, instead of proving them correctly, proving them wrong, it's, well, such and such a organization did not release this information, so if they're not forthcoming with information, they must be lying to us. So they're sort of taking the opposite of an academic, like you or I, or what Brian aspires to be, where we are looking for things that help prove our own point instead of saying, well, they're not doing something, so we're not going to believe them. And I think that that's a big part of it. Also, there is a lot of ins and outs to this case, and to just really, I don't want to say take your knowledge from a movie, because I think that these conspiracy theories existed before JFK. I think nowadays it's just so much easier. Oh, well, the U.S. government didn't do any kind of research into such and such a person as far as 9/11, so I'm not going to believe it until they release this. Or there was a camera outside of Pentagon, and well, they didn't release that tape, so they must be hiding something. And it's very unfortunate, because it's really just goes to show this confirmation bias that is with a lot of people who do believe in conspiracy theory. One thing I did want to point out, and then we will get into some of the specifics with JFK. According to a recent survey that was published in 2017, the percentage of Americans who have at least a college degree continues to rise. And SurveyMonkey found that 42% of Americans with at least a college degree believed Oswald acted alone, compared to 29% with less than a college degree.
I think going to your point about the lack of transparency, or we find out that they're not releasing information, one of the things that I was fascinated with was Oswald's trip a month before the assassination to Mexico City. And a lot of this was revealed, again, in this new batch of information that was just released last year that have been classified. And if you can have a totally one view that it's a benign cover-up by the government, and I'll get into that when I explain that. And you can believe that Oswald acted alone at the same time the government was covering up and hiding things. Well, what were they trying to hide? Well, Oswald goes to Mexico City. He has this history of going to the Soviet Union, living in the Soviet Union, marrying a Soviet woman, and then coming back to the United States and being involved in communist activities. He was for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee while he was in New Orleans. He's well known to American intelligence because of his he didn't actually defect, but give up his citizenship, but his relationships with the Soviet Union, Soviet embassy. So he was being tracked by, and again, part of this looking bad. Well, how did this happen when the FBI was tracking him, CIA was tracking him, naval intelligence knew about his whereabouts? There was an agent, Hosty in Dallas, who was trying to interview him before the assassination. He never quite got to him. And so Oswald is down in Mexico City, and he goes to the Cuban embassy and the Soviet embassy. And he's trying to get a visa, it looks like, to go to Cuba and maybe go back to the Soviet Union. And so he goes into the Soviet, and this is amazing to me, because he just walks in one day and he meets the consular people there at the Soviet Union, and unbeknownst to him, he's talking to a KGB agent, the secret police. They're not just diplomats there. So he goes in, and these diplomats, these Soviets now, since the Soviet Union has broken, have written a book about this. And Kosovo Kostovov, it was one of the agents there, and Oswald comes in, and he's saying, "Oh, I got to get out of America. The FBI is after me. This is very terrible." And Oswald then pulls a gun. This is true, and pulls out a handgun. It was the same weapon that you saw him in the pictures later on.
I brought that up in the paper. How about what was it? About a week before he assassinated Kennedy, he had his picture taken with that weapon.
Yes.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting.
And he puts the weapon on the table, and it's loaded. And the KGB guy picks it up, takes the bullets out of it, and listens to his story. And then he gives the story, and he kind of gives them a run around and say, "Okay, we're going to see what we can do. Of course, we can't make any decisions. We have to ask Moscow and all this kind of stuff." And so then they give him the bullets and the weapon back. But he is photographed with both the handgun and the rifle.
Right. I do remember
his
that
wife
picture.
took. Yeah, that's the same gun. He not only was speaking to a KGB agent, he was speaking to a KGB agent who was assigned. You can't make this stuff up. He was assigned to the assassination and sabotage unit in North America for the Soviet Union. So here you have Oswald meeting with an assassination guy from the Soviet Union a month before he allegedly assassinates the president. Now, what would that have done to the Cold War had that gotten out? So why we say I've been saying there's a benign cover-up in the sense we don't want this information to come out. And even Johnson said later, 100 million people could be lost if it was thought that the Soviet Union was behind the assassination of an American president.
Without a doubt.
So that, again, going on to your theory that misinformation and non-information breeds this conspiracy when you may have another explanation for it.
Well, and there are... I won't necessarily ask what your thought process is on this, and frankly, my opinion probably doesn't matter because I wasn't alive during the time. But there are some very common JFK conspiracy theories, and if you can shed any light on any of these, in maybe just a couple of sentences,
sure.
Because I have 6. Number one is probably one of the most common, in that there was a second shooter on the grassy knoll. What have you heard about that? What are some of the things that maybe could disprove some of those things?
That second shooter is, I guess, tied into a lot of the other conspiracy theories that whoever this other group was had a second shooter. And folks have said that they saw a flash, they hear noises coming from the front, the grassy knoll area behind. I had the opportunity to go to Dallas and walked around Dealey Plaza. And on the street in Dealey Plaza, they have an X mark where the first shot went off that didn't kill Kennedy. It was the one you were talking about that probably could have survived. And then they have a second X on the street where it's supposed to be the kill shot that actually you see the president's head kind of explode. So I got across the street behind the picket fence where they said the shooters were coming from. And I don't know anything about weapons or anything like that, but I could not see a line of sight from behind the fence to be able to hit Kennedy in the front. And that person, to me, would have had to been more up on the overpass in order to have a shot in. So that's just my little explanation as to why.
First person. I mean, you were there. So, okay, now here's one I actually hadn't heard a lot of. I mean, I kind of heard rumblings, but Umbrella Man. Apparently there was a gentleman that had an umbrella on like a beautiful, picturesque day in November in Dallas. Beautiful weather, not a cloud in the sky. And there was just a random gentleman, some of the photos, Umbrella Man.
Yeah, that's kind of a wacky one in the sense that whoever the conspirators were, the message that was supposed to be delivered was when he puts the umbrella up and down, he's supposedly sending a message. Again, going back to the Bay of Pigs, that Kennedy was held responsible by a lot of the Cubans for not having air cover. In other words, when the Cubans came into the beaches for the Bay of Pigs, there was no American air cover there. And I guess a lot of them thought that there should have been, and they could have been successful. So that's the theory there, that it's revenge by ex-Cubans because they didn't give Kennedy. Kennedy didn't really support them in the Bay of Pigs.
That one seems to be a little bit of a stretch. Well, next, we already kind of talked about, and it's the USSR connection and Cuban connection to Oswald, specifically talking about this excursion that you were talking about to Mexico not a month beforehand. So we did talk about that one. This is one I do want to talk about, and while we have talked about this briefly, the mafia connection. We've mentioned mentioned a few things about this mafia connection, but why would the mafia want the president dead?
Yeah, we're talking about the mafia, organized crime, and we have to remember that Robert Kennedy was the Attorney General of the United States at the time, and he was having a strong law enforcement against the mafia. So he was getting a lot of people upset. He was one of the persons that he got really upset was the head of the mob in New Orleans, Carlos Marcello. And Bobby Kennedy one day, well, he found out that Carlos Marcello probably was not in the United States legally, and he was really one of the big kingpins. And one day, Robert Kennedy ordered his agents to pick up Carlos Marcello off the streets of New Orleans, put him on a plane, and stuck him down in Guatemala. Put him down in Guatemala because he had I thought it was a fake birth certificate or passport that said he was born in Guatemala. So he dumped him in the jungle in Guatemala. That got them kind of mad.
I can imagine so.
Also, they were surveilling Sam Giancana, who was the head of the mob in Chicago. And FBI has picked up on tapes a lot of these mafia guys talking like, "Oh, we hate that SOB Kennedy. We want to get Kennedy. We got to get rid of him. We have to." So, well, how about Bobby Kennedy? And said, "No, you don't."
They're gonna go big.
Yeah, we don't end the problem by cutting off the tail. We want to cut off the head, meaning JFK.
Yeah.
So that's the origins of the mob theory.
And the last major one, because Brian, shockingly, there are hundreds of different. I mean, we could probably do podcasts for a month about all the different conspiracy theories. But one of the ones I found that was very interesting was the LBJ connection.
Yes.
Apparently, there's a subset of individuals who believe that LBJ was one of the people who had his hand in the whole thing.
Yeah, that's another one that's kind of way out there. The only thing you would say about that was LBJ was a strong politician in his own right. He ran against Kennedy for the 1960 Democratic nomination, and you'd think he was the majority leader of the Senate. He had a strong backing. Kennedy, this new guy on the scene, basically, and JFK beat him out for the presidency.
It's very unusual that somebody running against somebody else in the primaries would team together, isn't it?
And then it was a lot of back and forth as to who would be the strongest ticket. In those days, you always want to have a north-south, east-west connection. So we have Boston and Texas. And there's a little backstory about that, but eventually Kennedy said okay to putting Johnson on the ticket. So he's the vice president. Of course, he has the motive, right? If the president is...
But of course.
But to actually have hard evidence on that one is way out there.
Well, John, we're wrapping up the podcast today. This is going to be the longest podcast in nightly news history, but I certainly don't mind because, as we mentioned several times, we could continue to go on.
Yeah, this is
Can I
great.
bring something up before you call it off?
Sure.
I found this interesting. I'm sure you've heard this before, Mr. DeLeo, but
Yeah.
How there's a lot of similarities between Abraham Lincoln and John F.
Yes,
Kennedy.
yes.
I think this is it's kind of like a conspiracy theory. You would say like Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846 and Kennedy was 1946. They are both elected. Lincoln was 1860. Kennedy was 1960. They were both shot on a Friday. Lincoln was shot in the Ford Theater. Kennedy was shot in a Lincoln made by Ford.
No, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and they were both directly concerned with the civil rights. And Lincoln lost a child while living in the White House, and so did Kennedy. So there's a lot of things that they intertwine.
They both had vice presidents named Johnson.
Yes, I was just about to say that one too. Booth was killed before being brought to trial, and Oswald was killed before being brought to trial.
And Oswald was captured in a theater, and Kennedy was assassinated from a guy from the warehouse, and John Wilkes Booth was caught in a warehouse. So that's another little...
It's crazy.
That's very interesting. I've never really heard that before. Okay, well, thank you for bringing that up, Brian. I appreciate that very much. So we are coming into a very final question here, John. And number one, the Nightly News really appreciates you coming down. I know this is your first time, and I would like to have you back again in November. And maybe we can talk a little bit more in depth about the assassination and some of the things that you've seen in your time. And Brian, of course, I'd love to have you back.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the only news in this case has basically been over the last 6 months or so since a couple of different batches of paperwork has been released. Of course, there were some in November of 17, and recently, April 26th of 2018, the National Archives released documents previously withheld in accordance to the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that act?
Sure.
Because this is actually something that I just found out just in researching for the show.
Yeah, actually, it was actually passed after the movie that we've been talking about, the JFK movie, because there was such a public uproar about it. And so they actually passed a law, and basically it said all of the agencies were directed that any information on the JFK assassination were to deliver it to this national repository, and they would be all placed in there. So if you have files from New Orleans, you have files from the CIA, Naval Intelligence, everywhere you can get them, they were supposed to be deposited into this one and cataloged. And then there were triggers sent into, and of course they had to be declassified. And so there were triggers sent into at certain points of time. The president was authorized to release these documents over a period of time. And so that's why we had these recent, there's been other ones that have been released over time. And so the recent batches were released, and some, not all were released, so that was the thing. And it's all it has to do with this classification that I think all of them were scheduled to be released, but I kind of think the intelligence community came back and said, well, we have to hold back these until we could really take a look at them.
The vast majority of the collection, and it notes 88%, has been open in full and released to the public since the late 1990s, but that there still are about 12% of the total of this repository that still remains classified and will remain so, and will not be declassified until 2021.
And one of the things that came out, which we talked about the Soviet connection, that I was reading recently, was that when Oswald was over in the Soviet Union, he was upset that he would not be able to stay, and he eventually got a job working in a factory. But he actually tried to commit suicide there. And so the Soviets were well aware of him. And then when he goes to the embassy in Mexico City, again, they're aware of him. And this recent batch of documents want to make it clear that, and the book that was written by Kosovo, who was the KGB agent, makes it very clear that they thought he was some type of a nut. It says, some type of a maniac, that he was unstable, the way he reacted in front of them. And they want to make it clear to the American authorities in these documents that he's not an agent of us. We would have nothing to do with him. We don't think he's stable enough to be one of our guys. And he's being tracked. We know that he's being tracked by the Americans. And this is a person we would never use as an agent. So again, that comes out in the recent batch of documents,
which I think is kind of, while some of the reporting that I heard on this said that a lot of these documents really just provided additional context and there's no bombshell in any of them, I think it does go to say that I'm hoping that it's starting to quiet down some of the conspiracy theorists. And I will say that the number of people who believe in the JFK conspiracy is at its lowest point since prior to 1970. So I will say that it's still certainly one of the most common conspiracy theories. Again, we talked about more than half of the people in the U.S. believing in some type of conspiracy theory. But I think that some of these new documentation kind of just shows that Oswald was not mentally stable and more than likely did act alone on this. So, John, I got to thank you so very much for joining us today. We're clocking in today at just about an hour on the podcast.
Okay.
But this is great, and I'm so happy that we got to do this. We've been talking about this for quite some time. Maybe next time we'll have to chat a little bit more about some of the things that we didn't get to cover, because, again, we could make a whole series out of just doing this podcast. So, John, it's been my pleasure to have you down today, and I just want to thank you very much for spending your afternoon with us.
I really enjoyed it, and thanks, Brian and Paul, and I enjoyed it, and definitely will come back.
Well, we will have you back to talk a little bit more closer in November when the assassination, the
we can
anniversary.
talk about a lot of other stuff.
Well, and there's a whole mess of other things that we can talk about, just the assassination itself. I think that next time we'll focus a little bit more on that. So,
sounds good.
John, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks again.
Brian, thank you so much for your time and enthusiasm about this JFK.
This was fun. I really enjoyed this. I think we should have more stuff like this, like history events. We should talk more about. I think that's really interesting.
I do my very best on booking your show.
I know you're so busy with all these different shows with activities and sports. the club is really doing good with this. It really is.
And you are one of the people to thank for that. So, Brian, thank you very much, not only just for everything that you do, but for really, really wanting to be a part of today's podcast. So thank you very much, Brian. All right. So for Chair of the Legal Studies Department, John DeLeo, and for Nightly News President, Brian Christiana, this is Professor Paul Miller, and we will catch you next time on the Nightly News Podcast.